this session, we're going to move on to the other 9 principles. Because when people embrace happiness levels 3 and 4, it leads to embracing 10 universal principles of civilization that are critical in our respect life work. So we're going to whiz through these 10 other principles, these 10 principles of civilization, and apply those levels 3 and 4. Here's what I mean by this. Remember, if a person does not function through level 3 and 4, if they're not living for level 3 and 4, they're not going to have a reason to care about the principles I'm teaching you next. And that's why it's critical that we always start with the 4 levels of happiness. We always try to help elevate what people are living for, how they define these critical personal terms first. If you don't do that work, they could buy all the principles and say, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, but I don't care. Because it doesn't get me ahead. It doesn't lead to power. It doesn't give me what I want right now. Okay? So it's really important to do that work of the 4 levels of happiness first before we move into these principles. The 10 principles can be divided into 4 categories. The first one is a fundamental principle of how we identify ourselves and the meaning and purpose of culture. The next 3 are called principles of reason or principles of truth or logic. The next set of 3 are principles of ethics or morality. And the last 3 are principles of justice and natural rights. So let's start with that first one, the first principle of identity and culture. This one we've kind of already talked about, but we'll put it into words. It first originated in Jesus. And it teaches us that true happiness comes from giving myself away for the good of other people, not from sacrificing other people for the good of myself. And the way that you help people move to this principle is through everything we did in the first session. And usually, by that point, people will agree with this, at least idealistically, if they haven't yet put it into practice. They're believing and agreeing to it in their minds, and that's a good first start. Let's go through the 3 principles of logic, or the 3 principles of truth now. These principles are essential for establishing who we are as human beings. And so I'm going to focus on the human person and the fetus in this section, because it's a good example, and it deals with many of our Respect Life ministries. We'll often hear the argument, it's not a person, or the fetus is not a human being, or it's a human being, but it's not a human person. Or they'll argue that we can't know whether or not it's a human person, so we should just agree to disagree. But there are 3 fundamental principles of truth, of logic, that the pro-life movement did not create. These principles are essential to everything from science, to mathematics, to economics, to how we establish our social policies. These are critical principles of civilization. And if a civilization literally abandons these logical principles, that civilization will begin to destroy itself because people can no longer have logical conversations. Their laws and their rules will be irrational and illogical. People will know that. They will stop following them and you'll have chaos. And so it's important, if you want a civilization, to be rational in your policies, in your laws, in what you teach, in how you order society. These principles should not be abandoned lightly. The first one is the most basic principle of all logic. All reason is grounded in this one principle, the principle of non-contradiction. If we can't even assent to this principle, no other principle of logic matters. It's a principle of non-contradiction which originated in Plato and Aristotle, and it states this: valid opinions or theories or definitions have no internal contradictions. In other words, if something is real, then it cannot be both X and not X at the same time, at the same place, in the same respect. In the same respect means adhering in the same substance, like in your mind or, in this piece of clay. A real being cannot be both X and not X at the same time, the same place, in the same respect. So the argument that, well, when you're talking about the unborn child, is it a person or not? If you argue, well, it's a person if you want it to be and not if you don't, so we'll just agree to disagree. It's a completely illogical, irrational argument. You can't ground your law in that, because then it becomes an irrational law. The unborn child is either a full human person or it is not. If it is not a full human person, then it doesn't have the rights and dignity that you and I have. And I'm wasting my time in the last 25 years of my life. If it is a full human person, then it does have full human dignity and full human rights. And Roe versus Wade would be an egregious crime against a huge number of human beings, of real human beings. It is critical and essential that we answer this question. In Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court violated the most fundamental principle of logic when it claimed that we cannot know whether or not the unborn child is a human being or not. So we'll just agree to disagree, and we'll set up this trimester thing, which was a farce in the first place. And we'll establish a boundary that after the first 3 months, before the first 3 months, you can have abortion for any reason whatsoever. Second 3 months, it has to be, a state if it wants to can regulate the procedure, but cannot make abortion illegal for any reason. And in the third trimester, a state if it wants to can make abortion illegal, except if abortion is necessary for a woman's health, and her life or health of the mother, and health was defined in another Supreme Court case called Doe versus Bolton as anything pertaining to the woman's mental health or psychological health or physical health, her well-being, her familial status. It could mean anything. So we know that there was no compromise there, and even if there was, it wouldn't have been good enough. Because you can't compromise. You have to answer this question. Are we dealing with a human person or not? It's an essential, critical question. Principle of non-contradiction. Sometimes students will say, well, why can't I hold a contradiction? If we can't agree anyway, why can't we just agree to disagree? Because contradictions are irrational, and they will cause a lot of problems. Right? A square does not equal a circle. You can't have a square circle. It's impossible. Try to think of a square circle in your head. Anybody doing it? Raise your hand if you did it. Okay. I have many audiences where they did it, and they get up here and they draw this. That is not a square, and it is not a circle. It is half of a square and half of a circle. You can call it what you want, but it's not a square circle. You cannot have something that is a full square and a full circle at the same time, the same place, adhering in the same substance, in your brain, in your imagination, in some wood, in some clay. It's impossible. Why? Because the definition of a square excludes the boundaries of a circle. A square is defined as 4 equal sides with 4 intrinsic right angles. A circle is defined as no sides with no intrinsic right angles, right? A complete self-enclosed whole. It has no right angles and no sides at all. So if that's the case, then you cannot have a square circle because the boundaries of square naturally exclude the boundaries of a circle. So you cannot have a person, non-person, at the same time, at the same place, adhering in the same being, because it's a contradiction. The boundaries of what a person is exclude the boundaries of being a non-person. You're either one or the other. Well, how do we know whether the unborn child is a full human person? Can we use reason and logic to arrive at a conclusion? We can. There's a very basic principle of reason and logic called the principle of objective evidence. It also originated in Plato and Aristotle. And it teaches this: non-arbitrary opinions or theories or definitions are based upon publicly verifiable evidence, data that other people of reasonable intelligence can replicate and verify. So, if I were to say to you that little green Martians come and visit me in my bedroom at night every night, it would be logical for you to say, oh, prove it. And so if I were to say, well, I can't, you would say, well, why not? And I'd say, well, because they only appear to me. And you'd say, well, that's okay, I'll hide in your closet so they don't see me. I'd say, no, they won't come out, they'll know you're there. They're invisible, except to me. Oh, well, tell them to move something around, they won't do it. Right? If there's absolutely no way that any other human being can verify that little green Martians are in your room, or in my room at night, you would be right to doubt the veracity of my claim and to think that I'm insane. Because you cannot claim that something is objectively true without having any evidence that other rational people can verify. It doesn't make any sense. So you have to have objective evidence. Now, all the time we hear from the pro-choice movement that the unborn child is not a human person because of all kinds of evidence that is completely arbitrary, that has no objectivity to it at all. For example, you can find these arguments online. Some of the most famous arguments of why the unborn child is not a human person is because at certain stages you cannot see it with your naked eye. Well, that's because at certain stages a human person is too small to see with the naked eye. What does that have to do with anything? And I can't see an astronaut out in orbit with my naked eye either. Are they not human persons? It's completely arbitrary. Another argument that they frequently use is it doesn't breathe yet. Well, frankly, unborn children do breathe at a very young age. Right? Their lung buds are absorbing oxygen in ways that are different from the way that you and I absorb oxygen. But I will agree that at a certain stage prior to that, they are not breathing in oxygen because they don't need to in order to survive. So why are you choosing being able to breathe oxygen through your lungs outside of the womb as the criteria for what makes you be a human person? How does that suddenly make you a human person? If that's what makes me a human person, well then, is everything that breathes oxygen a human person? What makes us different? How do we define ourselves as distinct from other beings, if that's what makes us a human person? There are lots of people who are walking around today who do not breathe oxygen the way that you and I breathe. Are they lesser human persons? My father had to breathe oxygen through a tube in his nose for a whole year before he died. Was he less of a human person because he didn't breathe oxygen through his nose and mouth the way other people do? Sometimes they use the argument, well, the unborn child is dependent on the mother, and so it's not a human person. Okay, so being completely independent of another human person, of any other human person, is what makes us a full human person. How many of us in this room are completely independent of other human beings to survive? None of us are. Certainly not a newborn, certainly not my 3-year-old, doubtfully my 6-year-old. None of us are. We all rely on one another. We all are dependent on other human beings for our survival. All of these arguments become more and more and more arbitrary. The recent one I heard in the debate was, the unborn child is not a human person because it lacks a social identity and a name. Can we just give her a name then and a social security number and then she's a human person? I mean, you know, there are Aboriginal tribes out in the world that they don't name each other. They don't have names for each other. And they don't have any social identity because we don't even know they're there. So are they not human persons? And aside from all of these examples, why? Why that criteria? What is your rationale for choosing that criteria for what makes us a human person? How is this not completely subjective and completely arbitrary? Let me attempt to give you an objective definition of the human person based on objective evidence that can be verified by other rational human beings. In the 1970s, Dr. Jerome Lejeune, who was a French geneticist, used DNA sequencing to prove that the full human genetic code is present in the unborn child at the moment of sperm-egg fusion, which occurs in a split second, in less than a second. At sperm-egg fusion, you have a complete, new, independent, unique, unrepeatable human genetic code. You've got a new entity of human origin, a human being. And some people say, oh, well, my hair cell has a unique human genetic code too, and so does my toenail cell and my stomach cell. Ugh. Yeah, that's true. It has your human genetic code. But this being has a unique, individual human genetic code that is distinct from the mother and the father, which means it is a distinct individual being of human origin. An individual, independent human being biologically. But we are not just defined by our biology. There's more than that. Dr. Jerome Lejeune gave this quotation on his research that I thought was just beautiful. He says, to accept the fact that after fertilization has taken place, a new human being has come into being is no longer a matter of taste or opinion. The human nature of the being from conception to old age is not a metaphysical contention. It is plain experimental evidence. If you don't believe him, you can do your own DNA sequencing and come to the same conclusions that Dr. Jerome Lejeune has done. And in fact, it has been done many times, which is why every embryology textbook notes that at the moment of sperm-egg fusion, you have a new, distinct, individual being of human origin. Still taught in embryology today. But we need more than that, because human beings, we can tell by observation, are not just biological creatures. This principle is critical to that. The principle of complete explanation also originated in Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and it teaches that if you really want to know the fullness of what something is, not just imposing your arbitrary definition, but know the fullness of what something is, the best opinion or theory or definition is the one that explains the most data. So, if you have a theory about something and you explain a lot of the data, but somebody comes along and can explain more of the data than you have, including the data you've explained, then that other person's theory is probably a better theory than yours is. Okay? This is just a principle that's used all the time in science. When somebody can explain more of the data than somebody else, the old theory is usually abandoned. Or it's studied further, and then when they find out, yeah, everybody can replicate, the more data has been explained by this second theory, they abandon that first theory. Right? So Newton's theory of gravity was overtaken by Einstein's theory of special theory of relativity, because he was able to explain more data than Newton was. So, what does this have to do with our definition of the human person? If you want to define what a human person is, you can't just look at it biologically, because there's lots of evidence that a human person has a transcendental nature. that human persons are more than just what you can see and touch and look at through biological instruments, through scientific instruments. Let me give you an example of this theory a little bit more expanded. Aristotle pointed out that there are 4 different ways you can define something, and you need to explore all of these in order to get all the data. The first way to understand what something is by looking at its appearances, which doesn't just mean visual appearances, but what does it look like? What does it taste like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What are all of its physical components and parts? So for example, if you're trying to define an acorn, you could say, well, an acorn is small and round and green with a little brown cap on top. It's about 1 inch high. It's kind of hard. It smells a little oaky. But that's not a real definition of the acorn, any more than it is to define a human person based on what we look like. Any definition that excludes the unborn child from human personhood because it doesn't look like we do is an arbitrary definition because it is using subjective criteria based on the first way by observation only, and it's missing all kinds of data that is accessible to us. Second way of defining something beyond appearances is to look at something's, what Aristotle called something's powers. What he meant by powers is not like Superman powers, that you can do. He meant what is the thing capable of actualizing? What is it capable of actualizing at that moment? Right? Maybe it can't actualize it right now, but the power it has to actualize if all the conditions are met. So for example, an acorn that has been fertilized has the power of growth. Even before it starts to grow, that power now exists in it. Right? It has the power of water absorption, nutrient absorption. And you can tell that it has those powers because when you give it water and nutrients in the soil and a little bit of warmth, it begins to grow. Those powers existed even before they were turned on. How do we know? Give them the conditions it needs. Don't add anything substantial to the acorn. Just give them the conditions of water, nutrients in the soil, some warmth, right? Some moisture, it will begin to grow. So it has the capacity to absorb water and nutrients to grow. It has the capacity to photosynthesize. That means to take sunlight energy and transform it into chemical energy. It has the reproductive powers. Eventually it will begin to form new little acorns. All those powers are present in a fertilized acorn as an acorn, which leads you to the third way to define something. What are the conditions that are necessary to turn those powers on? An acorn needs water. An acorn needs sunlight. An acorn needs warmth. An acorn needs nutrients in the soil. Those conditions are important to understanding the fullness of what we are. Right? It's a water absorber, a nutrient absorber, a sunlight absorber. That's part of what it is. Then that leads you to the fourth way to define something. It's telos. T-E-L-O-S. It's the Greek term that means its objective end. Its end, its final destiny. What is the final end, the telos of an acorn? Written within the genetic code of an acorn is already the instructions for oak treeness. It's already in there. It already contains all the data, all the information for growing the way an oak tree grows. It already has the nature of oak. Now, am I claiming that an acorn is a tree? No, I'm not. Right? Because the tree, the full tree, is just a stage of development. But it is an oak. It already is an oak. It already knows how to grow as an oak, how to do what oaks do, how to form itself into a full-formed oak, which is a tree. In the same way, I would argue that an unborn child at the moment of sperm-egg fusion already contains all of the data, all of the information to guide itself towards its own development into adulthood. Am I claiming that the embryo or the zygote, right, is an adult? No. But it already is a full human person because it contains already all of its own data to guide itself. It has its own guiding impetus towards the development as human beings, as human persons develop. You don't have to add anything to it once sperm-egg fusion has occurred. Of course, it needs the conditions necessary to turn those powers on. Water, nutrients, right? Some sunlight. It needs all those conditions, but so do you, because you're not fully developed either. Right? So all those things are going on. All that stuff is happening. Now, I hear an argument a lot of times when I debate. When I debated this physician at the University of California, Berkeley, he makes an argument that he won't do abortions after the nervous system is fully formed, because at that point he thinks, okay, now it's a human person, so I won't do abortions past that stage. There is a very inconvenient fact that your nervous system is not fully formed until when? Anybody know? Between 20 and 25 years old. Which means I pointed out to the students in that classroom, apparently this physician may not think that you are full human persons here, because most of you do not have fully formed nervous systems yet. I said, aside from that argument, why pick that arbitrary place? Why? That doesn't even include all of the data of what it means to be a human person. Why the nervous system? Why not something else? And also, some of us would start to argue that after a certain age, you start to lose the functioning of that nervous system. So what, you become less of a person at that point? We have to now decide what degree everybody is for a human person so that we can use you as slaves or kill you or what, dispose of you as we will. What does that mean? Here's what I would argue. A human person is a living being of human origin, which we get genetically, right? Human origin, which contains all of the information necessary to guide its own development towards the actualization of its transcendent nature. Period. That's the fullness. That includes all the data that we have accessible to us as human persons. It includes all of those levels of happiness. Because that's everything that we have open to us as possible fulfillment of our nature. And if you exclude any one of those levels of happiness for the definition of a human person, then your data is incomplete. A human being is not just what we are biologically. We have to include that transcendental nature because the data is real. Human beings are capable of love, generosity, kindness, compassion, self-sacrifice, goodness. All of these things cannot be viewed through a microscope. They don't have physical parts or components to them. They are transcendental in nature, which means that there is a part of our nature which has a transcendental aspect. A human person is a living being of human origin, which contains all the information necessary to guide its own development towards the actualization of its transcendent nature. Do you fit this definition of a human person? Sure you do. Does a developmentally disabled person fit this definition of a human person? Sure he does. There's lots of evidence that people with profound disabilities have access to love, to knowing God, to knowing when your love is authentic or inauthentic, to sensing when an act of generosity or kindness is present, to sensing when compassion is there. We can even see this ability to sense that in a newborn child. We even see this in unborn children when there are twins. We can see little acts of sharing and kindness and generosity even going on there in these unborn children is amazing and fascinating, which is taking place obviously not on a conscious level because their brain isn't developed enough, but there is some aspect to their nature that is having access to this love. Right? And if you deny it, you cannot prove that it is not there. That would be my argument. Unless you can definitively prove that this being, when every other way appears to be guiding its own development towards a transcendent nature, you have to err on the side of assuming human personhood is present. To not do so is to risk committing an egregious harm. And we don't risk that harm in any other area of law, except abortion. Why? What is the justification? Because it's so small, because it doesn't breathe through its lungs yet, because it doesn't have a social identity, because it doesn't have a name, because it's still dependent on its mother. How is this not completely arbitrary and subjective? Now this leads us, of course, into another set of principles. Once we know what a human person is, how do we treat human persons? And these principles will be very helpful to those of you who work in areas of social justice, as well as the respect life areas. There are three fundamental principles of ethics that are the basis of all other principles of ethics. Without these three, you can't have any other ethics, and this is the first. All ethical principles are grounded in this one principle. It's called the principle of non-maleficence, and maleficence, right, there was that movie Maleficent that came out recently. What was she? She was the embodiment of evil, right? Okay, so maleficence stems from the word mal, which means evil or bad. So non-maleficence means do no harm, or do no evil. And this originated in Moses and Jesus, and interestingly, every major worldwide religious tradition has some form of this principle in its laws, in its rules. Do no harm. Another way of stating it is avoid unnecessary harms. And if a harm is necessary, if it's unavoidable, minimize it as much as possible. Why? Why should I do that? Because human persons are intrinsically valuable, infinitely valuable. And so the ethical way to treat human beings is to not harm them. Why? Prove that human beings are intrinsically infinitely valuable. Because we have a transcendent nature, a nature capable of love, generosity, compassion, goodness, faith, being unconditionally loved, being a beloved of the unconditional itself. And there is no quantification of that data. It makes you infinitely valuable. Now, can you reject all of this? Sure you can, but you would be rejecting your own infinite nature. You would be rejecting your own transcendental worth. You would be condemning yourself to level 1 and 2 happiness. And I would just argue it's a really sad way to live. Keep that level 3, 4 in your toolbox in case later on you decide level 1 and 2 is not worthy of you. But if you move to level 3 and 4, all those other dominoes begin to fall. Just like clockwork. Level 3, 4 is more worthy of me. My nature now is transcendent. My dignity is a transcendent dignity, which means now I have to include that in the definition of who I am as a human person, which means now I have an ethical duty to how I treat other human beings. And the most fundamental duty of all is do not harm. I'm just laying out a case. Just laying out a case. Second principle, by the way, fundamental violation of the principle of non-maleficence, which we've already talked about in the Roe versus Wade decision. Now, the Roe versus Wade decision argued, well, we don't know if it's a human person, so we didn't violate this principle. Oh yeah? What would we do in law if you were out shooting bear with your buddies, right? Maybe your buddy Joe, and you're out and suddenly you get separated from Joe, you don't know where he is, and you turn and there's something in a bush, and you don't know what it is. You get your gun, you're gonna shoot it, it might be a bear, but then you notice it could be Joe. I'll shoot it, it's probably a bear. And you shoot it and it was Joe. If you had reason to believe that it could have been Joe, and they could prove that in a court of law, you would be guilty of at least negligent homicide. Because our law functions with this principle all the time, except in Roe versus Wade, because we don't know whether or not it's a human person. This principle dictates that when we are uncertain about the presence of something as intrinsically valuable as a human person, we assume its presence until we can definitively prove otherwise. Why? Because your dignity as a human person is infinite. Harming you would be to cause an egregious harm. Do we really want to sacrifice this principle? Second principle of ethics, the principle of consistent ends and means. This principle originated in St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. And it's an easy one we've all heard many times before. The end does not justify the means. The end does not justify the means. What does that mean? It means the end goal that you're attempting to achieve, even if it is a good end, does not justify using an evil method or an evil means to get there. For example, with high school children, students, we sometimes use the example, it's Father's Day, right? You want to give him a gift. Why? Because you love him. That is a good end. You want to show him your love. You respect and honor his goodness. Because he's your father. So you want to buy him a gift, but you don't have any money. So when he's not looking, you steal $20 from his wallet to buy him the gift. Did you do it good? No. The ends do not justify the means. The means was an evil means. Why do the ends not justify the means? Because the evilness of the means undermined the good I was attempting to accomplish. I took the wind out of the sails, so to speak. When I did an evil thing, I disrespected and dishonored the man that I was trying to respect and honor by my act. So you're undermining the good end that you're attempting to accomplish. The word undermine is very interesting, fascinating. It comes from miners, actually, mining underground. And when they would build a mine, when they would dig a mine, and they would mine for gold or whatever, coal, whatever, they would sometimes go down and dig a mine under that mine to get even deeper. And what would happen to the mine on top? It would collapse, right? So the goodness you're trying to do collapses into the evil that you have done underneath it. That's a nice aside. Let's show an application of this principle in another area of social justice. Between 1932 and 1972, the United States Public Health Service conducted an experiment called the Tuskegee Syphilis Project. Many of you may have heard of this before, where they wanted to learn more about the effects of untreated syphilis on the adult African male. So they went to a place called Tuskegee in Alabama and got a group of people who agreed to be involved in this study. They were told that they were going to get, try to be given treatment for bad blood. They weren't told they had syphilis, they had bad blood, which could have been any number of things. And at the time that this study was started, it was not a bad study. It was well-intentioned. There was no treatment for syphilis. So the scientists were trying to study it so they could learn more about the effects so they could develop a cure. Unfortunately, in 1947, it was discovered that penicillin was an effective cure for syphilis. And the scientists didn't want to disrupt their study or the funding that they were receiving. they continued their study. They did not tell the men there was a cure. In fact, when government trucks came out to give free shots of penicillin to the poor populations, these scientists met the trucks at the border and said, you cannot come in here. This is a scientific study by the U.S. Public Health Service, which is funded by the government, so you don't have authority to come in here. And they did not allow them to be treated so they could continue their study. It ended in 1972 when word leaked out about what the scientists were doing. But by that time, look at what happened. 28 of the men had died of syphilis. 100 of them had died of related complications. 40 of their wives had been infected of the disease, by the disease, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. This is a very good example of how the ends do not justify the means. This same argument can be applied to any of the Respect Life issues. One argument would be embryonic stem cell research. There's some very good goals in scientists who are using embryos for scientific research. They would like to cure diseases. They would like to help people live longer. They would like to cure cancers, Alzheimer's. The problem is that the ends don't justify the means. In order to acquire embryonic stem cells, you have to kill the host, which is the unborn child. The unborn child must die in order for you to extract those stem cells. And so, in order to save some people's lives, you are killing other people. Sometimes people use this argument when I debate them on abortion. If we don't keep abortion legal, many women will lose opportunities that men have. They will not be able to achieve college degrees. They will not be able to achieve their careers. They will not be able to advance. They will not be able to compete with men financially and make as much money as men do. Well, first of all, I disagree with that premise. I don't think that's true. And there are a lot of organizations that are proving that it's not true, such as Feminists for Life. That you can have children, and if you live in a society that is just, you can get a college degree. It's possible. You can pursue a career and have your children, and of course there have to be sacrifices that will be made. But why not for the greater good? Why not? The ends do not justify the means. To kill somebody to advance my career farther than I could have if I had had the child instead is a complete violation of the ends that justify the means principle. But let's look at this third principle. Third ethical principle is the principle of full human potential. It first originated in Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Spaniard in the 1500s. And he actually owned slaves, I understand, but then at some point he realized it was wrong and gave them up. And he became a Dominican friar. And he became one of the most ardent defenders of the Native Americans against the Spanish conquistadors who were torturing, enslaving, and even murdering the Native Americans on the grounds, claimed the Spanish conquistadors, on the grounds that the Native Americans were less developed than the Spaniards were, and so they were less valuable or worthy as human beings, and probably even less of a human person, of a human being, than the Spaniards were. Bartolomé de las Casas developed this principle to argue in the famous debates against Juan Sepulveda, in front of the king, about why the Native Americans were full human persons and deserved protection under the law. It became one of the first steps in liberating the Native Americans from this atrocious abuse of human beings. And his principle says this: every human being or group of human beings deserves to be valued according to the full level of human development, and not according to the level of development currently achieved. You deserve to be valued according to the full level of what you could achieve if you reached your highest potential, not according to the development you have achieved right now. Do you really want to violate this principle and claim that your full worth as a human person is dependent upon what you are doing right now, upon the actualization you have reached right now? Because on any measure you use to measure, biological, intellectual, athletic, the use of our transcendent nature, we all have varying degrees of actualization. And that would naturally mean that we are varying degrees of human persons. The only non-arbitrary, objective way of arguing for the dignity and worth of a human person is to ground our worth and our dignity in our nature itself, in what we could achieve if we developed to our highest potential, which means that our dignity and our worth have a transcendent value from the moment of fertilization, from the moment that nature begins to exist. These are the three principles of justice. Now, why do they come last? Well, because first we have to have a knowledge of what makes life worth living so that we can care about these principles. Then we have to have an understanding of truth and reason so we can know what we are as human persons. Then we have to have principles of ethics so we know how to treat human persons before we can have principles that show us how to order society in a just way. If we don't first know who we are, what we're for, and how to treat one another, it's very hard to come up with just social systems. So justice we deal with last. Justice is based on the ethical treatment of human beings. That's how you know what justice is. Giving human beings what is due to them. Justice can be defined as giving to others what is owed to them. Our duty towards others to what is owed to them. Okay? So, simple definition of justice. And the notion of justice first originated in Francisco Suarez, who also lived in the 1500s. He was a Spanish Jesuit. A lot of good things came out of the Spaniards, especially the priests. But he was a Jesuit. And Francisco Suarez was making a case against the terrible treatment of people, particularly people in the lower classes, who were being abused and who were being harmed and who were even in some occasions losing their whole livelihoods and dying because of it, for the sake of the common good. The kings were claiming, for the common good, we have to build this road that is going to destroy all your farms, sorry. And what Suarez was arguing was that you cannot claim the common good if you are harming individual human persons, because the state has a duty to protect the dignity of individual human persons. That's what gives the state a raison d'etre, the reason for its own existence. The only thing that justifies the authority of a king, or a democracy, or a theocracy, or an oligarchy, or whatever form of government you have, the only thing that gives that government the authority to govern in the first place is the intrinsic dignity, the infinite worth of the human beings over which it is governing. If it abandons that, it becomes a tyranny. And then people don't have to obey that authority anymore because it is no longer legitimate. It no longer has the authority to govern. And so Suarez developed this principle, which was the first articulation of a human right, what he called a jus, with J-U-S, which is where we get justice from, the word justice from, right? A right. All human beings in themselves, by virtue of their existence alone, not any other criteria, how smart you are, how developed you are, all human beings in themselves, by virtue of their existence alone, possess the inalienable right to life, liberty, and property ownership. Inalienable means you cannot separate it. It's not separatable from the human person. It's part of their nature. These rights are part of your nature as a human person. They originate from your intrinsic dignity and worth. Right? I owe you these duties because of your infinite worth. So these rights are yours by nature, not because the state declared these rights into existence. A state cannot declare these rights into or out of existence. These are duties I owe you by your nature. So these rights come from your nature itself, not from a vote of the people or a pledge of the government or whatever. No government gives these rights, so no government can take them away. Two questions to answer. First of all, why these three? Why life, liberty, and property? Because these three are conditions that are necessary for these are the basic elements that are necessary to protect for your nature to thrive as a human person. You need present existence. That's life. You need possession over your future existence. That's liberty. Why do you need possession over your future existence? Because the highest point of your nature, the highest aspect of your nature is your capacity to love, right? And if that is true, what is love? Acting on the desire, making a choice on the desire to do a good for the other beyond the good for myself. In order to make choices, I have to be free. So I have to have freedom. Liberty is a part of my nature, part of who I am, so you owe me the duty to protect my liberty. And then property, why that one? Well, because you could have a government that claims, well, nobody can kill you and nobody can take away your liberty, but there's no such thing as property ownership, which means that the government's not going to do anything about people stealing what you have justly earned or what has been justly given to you, and now you don't have sustenance and you're going to starve to death. All right? You can't force people to become indentured servants to other people. You can't have a situation where people have no security. They need a secure social environment around them for existence, just for mere sustenance. So there is a certain level of this right which is inalienable. Now, obviously, there's a point when we say, well, at some point, this is not, your property is not an inalienable right anymore. You can amass so much wealth that it's putting other people's lives in jeopardy. And at that point, you know, the government steps in and says we have to share here. But there is a level of property that is an inalienable right, that is a natural right to you. These are essential. The second question that people ask is, well, wait a minute, the government takes away these rights all the time. Right? There are times when the government kills people in war and in, you know, capital punishment, That's not the government taking away a right, that's the government violating a right. Government cannot take away your right to life, or liberty, or property, which is why even in prison there are certain liberties that you have to allow to people who have been imprisoned, who have been convicted of crimes, because it is still their natural right to have liberty. But a government can justly infringe or violate these rights if it's necessary to protect people from you harming them. Right? So if you've committed an egregious harm, a terrible crime, the government can put you in prison, but only to the extent that it is necessary to prevent a greater harm to society. Right? This is frequently used as an argument for self-defense. It's frequently used in an argument for just war. We're not going to get into those things today, but I'm just showing you some examples of where they are applied. But at the very least, can we not see that this principle of natural rights has to apply to an unborn child at the moment of spermic fusion? That's when personhood begins. That's when his worth, the transcendent dignity begins. And so why would we not also owe him a duty to protect his life? By the way, many states, the law does allow protection of the inalienable right to property of the unborn child. You can leave an inheritance to an unborn child. But we do not protect his right to life. Fundamental violation of the natural right to life in Roe versus Wade. Then there's a second right that evolves out of this natural right to life. This is the principle of the fundamentality of rights. This principle was also originated in Suarez, John Locke, and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and John Locke, by the way, got their ideas from Francisco Suarez. And it states this. Okay, now you've got three inalienable rights, three natural rights, but sometimes they conflict. What do you do when one natural right conflicts against another natural right? Now, how do you resolve that problem? Well, it's not that difficult to resolve. Look at the non-arbitrary, objective way that these rights actually order themselves. Which right is a necessary condition for the very possibility of the other right's existence? Life is a necessary condition for the very possibility of liberty. In the same way, liberty is a necessary condition for the very possibility of property ownership. You have to have custody over yourself before you can have custody over things outside of yourself. And here's a little example. What's your name? Melanie. Melanie, if I own you, who owns all your property? I do, by default. Excellent, right? And so that would be good for me, but bad for you, right? So property is a right that is protected secondary to the liberty interest, which is why if you have property and you erect a fence, but somebody lives in a house on the hill above you, the only way that they can get out of their house to get to work is by using your road. The government would have an easement on your property and make you remove that fence so that person can get down, because his liberty interests of, basic liberty interests of coming and going from his house supersede your property interests. It's also an argument why slavery is wrong. Because you cannot claim property ownership over another human being who has a liberty interest at stake. And yet this principle was violated in Roe versus Wade with abortion. Because what we've done is we've claimed that a woman's liberty interest takes priority over the unborn child's natural right to life. But the natural right to life is necessary for the very possibility of the right to liberty. Without it, the right to liberty cannot be protected. There is a non-arbitrary, objective way of resolving this rights conflict. And if we say this is not important, that these are just concepts, that this is just theory, this is just abstract, it doesn't really matter in the end, you do that. You cut down this tree of human rights, and you threaten the whole rights system upon which our justice system is based. How can you now authorize any kind of a rights hierarchy treatment in any rights conflict when you have just cut down the tree? Either we live by these principles or we don't. To not live by these principles causes an egregious harm not just to the unborn child but to all of civilization. And then there's this final one. the principle of limits to freedom. This one originated in John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu. And this principle says, one person's or group's freedoms cannot impose undue burdens on other persons or groups. So you cannot claim a new freedom for yourself or for a certain group of people if it's going to simultaneously impose an undue burden on another group of people. And notice the word undue, unjust burden on another group of people. Sometimes some people have to be burdened for other people because proportionately it's more fair that way. But if it's not, if you're imposing an unjust and undue, a disproportionate burden on a group of people by this new freedom, then that new freedom is illegitimate. Abortion would be a good example of that. By trying to give women more freedom, freedom from pregnancy, freedom from childbirth, freedom from childcare, right? By claiming to give her this new freedom, we have imposed an unjust burden on another human being to have to die. Now, this principle can also be used when we're looking at the assisted suicide euthanasia debate at the end of life. A lot of times people will argue, well, wait a minute, maybe I could see all of this applied in the abortion debate, but what about at the end of life with euthanasia? There are no victims there. You don't have to choose euthanasia. It's for yourself. It's your own private personal choice. You don't have to avail yourself of it. You can choose to continue to live. Really? This new freedom has caused whole groups of unintended victims who are now being asked or told that they have a duty to die by the law of legalizing assisted suicide in Washington, in Oregon, in Montana. You can see this happening. For example, these are some of the classes of victims that we're seeing. People with low self-esteem. When somebody is dying and they already have low self-esteem and they hear their doctor say to them, you know, you now have less than 6 months of life to live, or whatever the law says. And so now if you would like, you can have assisted suicide. Here's what I would do. Here's what you would do. It's not very expensive. Blah, blah, blah. What is this person hearing with low self-esteem? My doctor is telling me that my life is no longer worth living. The whole society has gotten together and voted and determined that my life is not worth protecting. That's what they hear. Those with reversible depression, people with reversible depression, when they find out that they have a terminal illness, if that depression is not treated and they get the news that they have a terminal illness, that they have less than 6 months of life left to live, and so assisted suicide is now an available option, their depression can cloud their better judgment. In Washington State, between the time when you're told you have the terminal illness and you're allowed to then take the assisted suicide drug, there isn't time in that window for a doctor to diagnose depression and for you to take drugs and for those drugs to kick in for you to maybe make a different decision. And that's how most of these laws are going. The Stoic heroes, these are people who really haven't had access to levels 3 and 4 in their life. They've always been the level 2 heroes, and they hear this and they think that it's my duty. The right thing to do would be to just die and get out of the way. But these are people who, if they had more time and more access to people who would come to them and share with them a deeper message about the dignity and meaning of life, might have made a different choice. The elderly, especially women that we know, already feel like a burden, right, to everybody else anyway, and are always trying to solve everyone else's problems. They become victims. The poor and the uninsured or underinsured, and of course victims of inadvertent cruelty, like a daughter who comes and says to her mother, you know, Mother, I know you have these options, you're terminally ill, you know, you can stay alive, we love you, or you can choose assisted suicide, we'll support you in whatever you want, Mom. The mom doesn't hear, we'll support you. She hears, if I kill myself, you're okay with that. That's what she hears. And the poor and uninsured are a big problem. What's happening in Oregon is, this is Barbara Wagner. She was diagnosed for the second time with lung cancer, and she was on the Oregon Health Plan, which is where you go when you can't afford a more posh plan. And Barbara was told that her cancer was terminal, and so her health plan sent her a letter in the mail. Assisted suicide was legal in Oregon. She was sent a letter in the mail saying they would cut off her chemotherapy treatment, wouldn't pay for it anymore, but they would pay for assisted suicide if she chose to avail herself of that option. The burden to unintended victims is intense. This is creating a new freedom for some people. It claims to be a new freedom when it is creating whole classes of people who are becoming victims of the law. So these 10 principles are critical for a healthy human life. They're critical for a healthy civilization. They are principles that support everything we believe in the Respect Life movement, and they are principles that can be used in any area of social justice. So I encourage you to learn more about these principles and see their application.